Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Neapolitan session in which we ask the question that you see on the screen. When colleges close or merge, what happens to library electronic resources? My name is Michael Rodriguez. I'm a senior strategist for content and scholarly communication initiatives at Lyrasis. Joining me today are three fellow co-panelists. With us virtually is Patrick L. Carr. He's the program manager for library consortium operations at the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities. And with us in person are Teri Gallaway, executive director of the statewide California Electronic Library Consortium, as well as Jenny Emanuel Taylor, associate director of electronic resources for the Consortium of Academic and Research Libraries in Illinois, or CARLI. We've all had extensive experience in one way or the other with our institutional members who are undergoing mergers, closures, acquisitions, or other major structural changes, with major implications, of course, for the libraries and consortia, but also raising sort of larger questions about electronic resources in those situations, particularly with regard to things like perpetual rights and the transfer of those rights in the event of a merger. So in this session, we're hoping to share some insights into this trend of college mergers and acquisitions, share experiences from our own consortial perspectives, and Teri will discuss the results of a survey she conducted of library leaders and consortia directors on this topic. So jumping right in with a perspective for myself as representing Lyrasis, which negotiates license agreements on behalf of hundreds of our member libraries nationwide. So this is I think, a well-known map of college closings and mergers by state since 2016. This has been an accelerating trend, and the pandemic only accelerated it further. The darker blue indicates states where this trend is particularly pronounced, not surprisingly in places of overall sort of demographic decline, like in the Northeast and the upper Midwest, but also in places of what one would think are demographic growth in the South and the West Coast. So this map, I think, really underscores the national scale of this challenge that faces our industry. There are a plethora of reasons for colleges to close or merge. The demographic cliff is the phrase that's used most often in reference to the date of 2025 being when the traditional college-age population will begin to decrease. Nationwide. It's already decreasing in many locations, but the idea here being that this is going to lead to declining enrollment overall and sort of increased competition among colleges for a declining, traditionally college-age student pool, with an uneven impact, of course, based on geographic location, also type of institution, with state regional schools and smaller private colleges among the most affected. The pandemic also drove a lot of this trend, not so much closures during the pandemic, but in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic as federal relief funds dried up and colleges could no longer rely on those funds to sustain themselves. We're also seeing waning public confidence in higher education, which is manifesting in a couple of ways. The conservative movements really denigrating, I think, higher education with regard to bringing about a liberal society. And also, on the flip side of that, I think waning confidence in the economic value of a college education, which is particularly concerning. Colleges facing mounting costs and debts, many campuses overbuilt during the boom years and are now having to deal with debts on building infrastructure and so on. Federal accountability measures that are particularly hitting for-profit institutions, with more scrutiny being applied to student financial aid, and public disinvestment from higher education in general. I mean, this is the significant cuts that we've all seen at institutions like West Virginia University, I think, are a culmination of a long-standing trend of states reducing their investment in public higher education. As well as really speaking to this sort of corporate mindset that has infused higher education in the last 20 years, with the idea being that you can merge in order to gain operational efficiencies that make you more competitive. So this is a snapshot of some of the recent closings and mergers that have impacted Lyrasis members. The different colors mean different things, which I won't go into right now. But you can see a trend toward, of course, the closures happening heavily in the Northeast. So 12 of our members have closed or were acquired in lieu of closure since 2022. And they're located from Florida to California to Massachusetts, but again, concentrated in that northeastern area. These are private institutions only. I did not put public institutions. There are a couple dozen of those that did not make it onto this slide. So this obviously creates a lot of pressure and uncertainty for the staff and the students who are being impacted, but I wanted to note the financial risks to consortia in this context as well, and to vendors when libraries make renewal commitments but are then perhaps unable to pay those bills in a timely manner or close before they can complete, before they can ensure that all of the funds have been distributed. So what we've done at Lyrasis is really try to proactively identify and engage with institutions that are sort of at known risk of closure to make sure that we're able to support those folks, that we're able to communicate and serve as a go-between with them and the vendors to make sure that everyone's on the same page, get subscriptions prorated if need be, and just help as best we can. This is sort of a general risk profile for institutions that we've seen and that is reflected in the larger national data. So particularly, we've seen smaller private institutions. For-profit institutions, I think, are particularly vulnerable for a variety of reasons. Tuition-dependent institutions that don't have a lot of wealth or endowments to fall back on. Institutions with high acceptance rates that are really reliant on that on student tuition to cover their costs. Of course, institutions whose enrollment is declining or is already quite low, so under 1,000 students, under 3,000 students has generally been the profile. Accreditation that may be in jeopardy, geographic location, and interestingly, religious affiliation. I think as the traditional college age population, I think is less religiously committed than past generations, and that has been, I think, reflected in some struggles among religiously affiliated institutions to sustain themselves. So in terms of what consortia are doing to manage risks, Lyrasis has a couple of standard contract clauses that we incorporate into our contracts with vendors, emphasizing that neither Lyrasis nor participating institutions shall be charged interest or penalties in the event that payment doesn't happen within the agreed upon time frame. And also that while the consortium will strive to collect funds that the libraries have committed to a particular subscription, we won't be held liable in the event that that institution is unable to pay. And we've absolutely had institutions that have closed very abruptly and not being able to cover their commitments. And this raises, I think, larger questions, particularly in mergers around perpetual access and the transfer of perpetual access rights when typically a smaller college is acquired by another institution. Do perpetual rights that institution acquired transfer to the institution that is doing the acquisition? The way our license agreements are written currently, generally that's not the case. There's usually a no transfer clause in the license, right? So this is some sample language that we've been workshopping with the vendor to think about writing a transfer clause explicitly into the agreement and acknowledging that the vendor can may be able to charge a reasonable one-time fee for expanded access if access to that perpetually licensed work is going to be available to a much larger group of students than originally contemplated in the agreement. And these are some sources, resources for monitoring trends, some really useful information here from Forbes, Inside Higher Ed, accreditation bodies, and so on. So I'm going to pause there and transition to our next speaker, Jenny. Oh, this slide? Oh, I'll try to share these as well. I don't know if I can post them on the Charleston conference in Hoover, but I'll definitely try to do so. And feel free to reach out to us directly for these slides as well. Okay, I see cameras down. Over to you, Jenny.
All right, mic is working. So I'm Jenny Taylor, and I manage our e-resources brokering program at CARLI. We're the Academic Library Consortium in Illinois. And let's go ahead. So this is a map of our membership. As you can see, it's distributed throughout the state. I think so many people think Illinois, Chicago, everything is there. But that is not our reality. We are very geographically dispersed. And we are very much more than Chicago. We're still a predominantly rural state, and our institutions definitely reflect that. Our institutional kind of geography is due to back in the prairie days when each church wanted a institution within really a day's drive so that they could train ministers and teachers. So now we have a whole bunch of little tiny rural colleges that are spread out, and this is, the entire Midwest is much like this, and this is why the Midwest is a hotspot for institutional closures and mergers. Those institutions now they're suffering. Our rural areas are in decline. It's very hard to attract somebody from suburbia, from Chicago, down to a rural area, to a religious school to go to college. So the FTEs of these schools have been declining for many, many years, and they're so dependent on their enrollment that their finances are going down as well. And there's been the case several times now that we've had institutions close. We halfway, I don't want to say we joke, but we kind of halfway morosely joke at CARLI that we can write the book on institutional closures just because we've had pretty much at least one a year or a major merger. And as you can see, in the past 6 years since I've been at CARLI, we've had 3 closures, and since I've started these slides, we had 1 announced, so we're up to 4 closures. We have 4 mergers or acquisitions either in progress or have been completed in the last couple of years. And we've had 2 major restructures, and one of those institutions is the one that recently closed. And by major restructures, I mean getting rid of all undergraduate programs, getting rid of all in-person programs, selling off buildings so that they can raise money for their other core curriculum. So major changes. I spent a lot of time at conferences meeting with vendors saying, this is the reality in Illinois. You know, we have institutions selling buildings so they can pay their basic bills. Please don't raise our prices anymore with mixed success. There was a 2020 Hechinger report, which I cited in my last slide, and it said that 26 schools in our state had financial warning signs. So we have 128 members in CARLI, so that's a huge percentage. CARLI covers all of our nonprofit institutions in the state. We don't have any for-profits. And for-profits, as Michael was talking about, are a completely different beast, and they're closing as well. So that's kind of where we are. And I just have some tips and tricks for both libraries and vendors, and also consortia, if there's any consortia in the audience. The big thing is when you hear about a closure or a merger, communicate when you have any information, and communicate early and often. I hear this frequently from our vendors. Oftentimes they don't get notified until a library is pretty far down the closure process, because e-resources are honestly low on the priority list in a closure. E-resources are always going to be on. Most libraries are more concerned of what's going to happen to my print collection. Do I need to withdraw everything now in just a few months? And also communicate with your consortia or your rep when things change, and they will change. We've had dramatic changes. All of a sudden, we've had libraries been told the library is going to close. Everything has to be emptied out before the end of classes 2 weeks from now. And that changes how you're going to do business for the rest of the semester. So put clarity and importance on communication. And also, and I hate to say it, but to the campus overall, the library is very low-hanging fruit. The campus has so many bigger things to worry about right now, even just inventorying their assets and making sure their students have arrangements as to what their next steps are. the library is usually forgotten. And library staff in these institutions oftentimes come to CARLI and say, I don't understand why nobody seems to care about what I do with my print collection and, taking care of my student workers. And the library cares, but campus truly doesn't. We've had librarians that have tried really hard to find homes for their collections, especially when they're in niche areas or try to contribute as much as they can to our last copy program in the state, and then suddenly get the rug pulled out from them by an administrator saying, do not take any books out of this library. Box them up and they will be sold to a third party and they will take care of them. And every institution has been different. But administrators do see the library as an asset, and so they want to take control of everything that you do have in a library. For vendors, I also repeat the communication thing. I'm surprised at how many vendors are really paying attention to what is going on out there in their areas. Like we had one rep that's actually located about half an hour from us, and they did not hear about an institution that was closing an hour away, even though, of course, it was in the news and all over the place in our state. Our vendors may not know that things are going on, and our vendors rely on CARLI, or their consortium, to communicate that to the vendors. So reach out as soon as you can. Make sure your vendors are aware. And vendors should also be aware that you need to be reasonable here. These are libraries and librarians that are dealing with trauma, and they have to make a lot of decisions very fast. Negotiating things with you for the remaining time or just communicating to vendors is very low on their priority list. So give them some grace. Maybe extend some of their access as trials. I have my one library that recently announced their closure. They had a subscription due that's up at the end of the year, and I actually worked with a couple of vendors to extend their access through the end of May when they're officially closing as a trial, so they don't have to pay an invoice for 5 months or deal with that renewal. So things like that are just really appreciated, so they can continue doing most things as normal, but they can not have to worry about paying a bill for just a few months. And the other thing I want to drive home, if there are vendors in this audience, is that we have institutions that are desperately changing how they do business. And we really appreciate it when our vendors recognize that and recognize that sometimes their ways of doing things have to change as well because demographics are shifting so much in higher education. When an institution gets rid of all of their undergraduate programs, they're doing that in a desperate bid to stay open. And if they don't get some kind of guidance or relief from a vendor when their FTE has to decline by 50% because they're getting rid of those undergraduates, it really looks bad on the vendor side. So many of our vendors have been very inflexible of changing and adapting to these new realities. And the reality is that if an institution does not make up their financial losses, they're going to close in a couple of years, as we have recently seen. And then you won't get any revenue from that institution. So I think vendors need to be aware that libraries are working differently, and some of them are really trying just to desperately stay open. And my third area here is for consortia and licensing managers, communicating as much as possible, as I've said. I can't stress that enough. And also have licensing language in all of your licenses. I think that's one thing that has allowed this process to go pretty smoothly for e-resources for us. And partly because our license agreements have grown organically over time because we've faced so many mergers and acquisitions and budget shortfalls that we incorporate language that our vendors oftentimes don't like, but are kind of requirements to do business in the state of Illinois because that's our normal. The state of Illinois went 18 months without a budget a few years ago, so we know what it's like not to be able to pay bills, and the consortium was in the same boat because we do get state funding. And I just want to point out some of the language that we do have in our our draft license agreement. One thing is that we are pretty explicit but yet vague in our membership clause, that membership in CARLI changes, and occasionally we do add an institution. Right now, pretty much everybody, but we've added some special research libraries recently, and some tiny nursing schools. But our membership does change because institutions close, institutions merge. We have, that's constant. And we will maintain a list, and we expect, no matter what changes, that you will give access to our stuff and allow subscriptions for our members as they change. And the last several years, we haven't had centralized funds to do a purchase on behalf of the whole consortium. So we haven't really had to deal with some of those perpetual access issues, except for some older resources that we were able to subscribe to purchase in the past. But because we have this language, our vendors just allow us to kind of sunset those perpetual access collections to those libraries. And also, when there's a merger, then the library that's usually smaller library that's merging into the larger one, they have some of those same perpetual access agreement products that we've purchased for all of our members. They still get to carry over to the new member. So we're keep that language open. The other slide that I want to talk about is our compensation clauses. We are very strict about having an annual opt-in or out for our brokering program. We do not do multi-year commitments. And that's because our members have told us they don't know their financial situation from year to year. And we have subscriptions that do. We have libraries that will drop a subscription and then pick it up the next year when their FTEs go up slightly and they have more financing. So we are very clear, and this is a big cornerstone of our brokering program. Want to point that one out, and that they can opt in or opt out. I'm kind of running long on time. I realize I've talked a lot, but these are my sources, and we will pass it on to Patrick, who is virtual.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Connecticut. I'm Patrick Carr. I'm sorry that I couldn't be in Charleston in person, but I'm glad to be able to at least present remotely. I am the program manager for the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities Library Consortium, and I'm going to give you a very brief case study focused on the recent merger of Connecticut's 12 community colleges into the singly accredited Connecticut State Community College. It has a FTE of about 20,000 students and is now one of the largest community colleges in the country. If you could go to my second slide, please. But first, a word about my relationship to the consolidation. I do not work in the community college library. Instead, my role is to lead and support collaboration across all of the libraries of all of the institutions of the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities system. So prior to July of this year, there were 17 such institutions, but following the merger of the 12 community colleges, and there's now 6 institutions. There's 4 state universities. We have a small online-only college called Charter Oak State College, and then the newly consolidated Connecticut State Community College. The decision to consolidate the community colleges was made in 2017 by the CSU Systems Board of Regents. The board saw the consolidation as a way to improve the college's financial outlook, increase student success, and advance equity across Connecticut. This decision in 2017 then kicked off a massive and a very difficult process of transitioning from 12 colleges to one college with 12 campuses. Next slide, please. Zooming into the library realm, a key date in planning for the consolidation was June 2021. This is when my colleague Eileen Rhodes was hired as interim library director for the CT State Community College. Eileen faced the extraordinary challenge of determining how to lead the work to bring together the 12 community college libraries into one. So each of these libraries had a separate website, separate LibGuide instance, separate collections, separate policies, and so forth. So any one of those slices of separateness would be a whole presentation. But given the scope of today's session, I'm going to really zero in on e-resource collections. Next slide. In March 2022, Eileen oversaw the formation of an e-resources working group. The group was charged with ensuring that all community college students, faculty, and staff have access to a comprehensive suite of e-resources that is aligned with the Consolidated College's academic programs. The group was expertly led by Debbie Herman and Erica Sherris-Woolley, who are two of the community college campus library directors. So even though I don't work in the community colleges, I was invited to participate in this working group due to my experience licensing and managing e-resource access across the entire CSC system. Next slide, please. You should be on the phase 1 slide. An initial task was assessing all of the work that we needed to accomplish over the next 18 months and then sequence how that work would unfold. And we identified a 3-phase process that I'm going to summarize a very abridged version of that process. So in phase 1, which was from March 2022 to September, we inventoried the separate e-resource collections across the 12 community college libraries. We developed a plan to gather input from library faculty, or excuse me, from college faculty as well as library staff and administrators regarding the acquisition priorities. We prepared a draft budget, and we also established modes of authenticating students and faculty and staff for e-resource access. So one thing I want to note is that in addition to the core e-resource collection, which was the primary focus of the working group I'm describing, an underlying principle of the work on authentication e-resource access setup was that we wanted to make sure that individual campuses had the ability to license specific databases with access limited to those campuses if there was a particular programmatic need. And then another step in phase 1 was just determining best methods for handling ongoing access to individually purchased e-content. Next slide, please. And then from October 2022 to April of 23, we surveyed faculty regarding e-resource priorities. We also, and a major focus of the work was to prepare and issue a request for quotation to the vendor community for core e-resource collections. So we put that RFQ out, I believe, during the summer of 2022, and then we worked really hard to review responses. In some cases, we arranged demos and trial access. We did a lot of work to gather feedback from different stakeholder groups within the community college community, got quotes, and also developed a communication plan for the rollout. Next slide, please. And then phase 3, so that's from May of this year to August, but some of this work is still also ongoing. So we made final decisions about which e-resources to acquire. We finalized the authorization and authentication plans, and then we negotiated and signed license agreements. This is the part of the work that I was most heavily involved in. It was particularly challenging because in most cases, we could not actually execute an agreement until July 2023, which is when Connecticut State Community College became a legal entity. So it was a very interesting summer working with Eileen and others to get those licenses all executed. And then, we had to do the work of, access setup, getting admin credentials, customizations of user interfaces. We also built an A to Z list for the core e-resource collection. Next slide, please. The full membership of the group that carried out this three-phase process is listed in the slide here. And so this is my opportunity to really cast the spotlight on them for the staggering lift that they accomplished. And they did this all while carrying out their regular positional responsibilities in the libraries they work in, which in many cases are understaffed. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, aspects of the work is still ongoing today, but I can say that from my perspective today, the group was incredibly successful. Although in some instances, the specific databases that users have access to has changed, in almost all instances, students and faculty and staff had access to a broader and more robust e-resource collection than they did prior to the merger of the colleges. Next slide, please. And even more impressively, they have expanded the access in a way that saves money. In fact, an analysis that we performed showed that collectively, they're paying about $1.5 million less annually than they would have had to pay to separately license that core e-resource collection. Next slide, please. And then finally, if you want to learn more, I want to highly recommend a presentation that Eileen Rhodes gave recently. You can see the link hopefully on this screen or in the slide that you see there. And also please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Eileen Rhodes. We're happy to talk about the process and go into a bit more detail. But I will stop there and hand the mic to Teri. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Okay, I'm going to sprint through quite a few slides on the survey. We will finish this up and share out the survey so that you have more time to look at the underlying data, of course. So I'm Teri Gallaway, again, the Executive Director at SCELC, and I'm going to present a discussion of some early foundational inquiry within the SCELC and the ICALC, or the International Coalition of Library Consortia communities, on their experiences with and knowledge of the impacts of institutional closures. So just for context, SCELC is a library consortium. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are based in Los Angeles, California, and serve about 100 member libraries and several hundred affiliate libraries. Roughly 85% of the member institutions are in California, and about 40% of the affiliates are in-state. So we do have a national presence both in our member and affiliate programs. We do a significant volume of opt-in licensing, and we have a specialty in serving primarily private academics of under 3,000 FTE, which, if you've been listening, is the community that we're all concerned about. So in terms of our direct experience with the merger and closure situation, you saw Michael's slide showing California as one of the hotbeds of recent closures. We have had 3 recent instances since I've arrived at SCELC in the last 2 years. Mills College was a merger with a much larger university. Marymount California University in Los Angeles was a closure. And this past summer, Holy Names University in Oakland, also in Oakland, closed. And I've got here next because as Jenny mentioned, you know, we always are mindful of the next person and the next one we have to solve. So today I'm reporting on those preliminary results, and the importance is, as Michael shared, many data sources point to the likelihood of those additional closures at private liberal arts colleges, and that is SCELC. So by doing this work, similar to my colleagues here from ICALC, as well as colleagues across the library and publisher community, we really want to understand the current awareness and preparedness for libraries fitting the profile type of the institution likely to be impacted. We also want to explore how vendors see the situation unfolding and what might be achievable between the 3 groups: libraries, consortia, and vendors. some gallows humor, since we're all probably feeling a little bit despondent about this situation. Don't panic. So what do we hope to achieve here? Our goal is really to avoid the loss of valuable and materials that were deemed ongoing to have ongoing value, those perpetual access assets within the library community. So it struck me as we worked on our management of our shared print retention commitments that we were really, through our closure, we were really only servicing the physical library, when in reality, our SCELC member library participation had been through acquisitions and subscriptions of electronic content. And I was wondering what duty we have to support our membership through the difficult, as we've heard, and complicated process of a merger or closure. So we initiated the survey to identify SCELC perspectives, both through the member deans and directors, and then a secondary lens of the electronic resources coordinator or primary acquisitions contact. We had 154 responses to the survey from the SCELC academic degree granting deans and directors. We heard from 49 of about 90. From the non-dean or director secondary representatives, where there was one. Again, we have a lot of small shops. There may not be a secondary contact. We heard from 44 of 66 identified contacts. And then from the U.S. academic consortial representatives, I identified 62 academic consortial representatives that had permanent staff in place that could talk about this. So 49 of those 62 organizations responded. Okay, so the first one, awareness of the enrollment or demographic cliff. They were asked to describe how aware they were about this prospect. And most had some familiarity with the aspect of the enrollment or demographic cliff. 67% of consortial directors were extremely or moderately familiar. Library directors about the same, 65% being extremely or moderately familiar, and less familiar at the ER management level, with just a third saying they were extremely or moderately familiar with the demographic cliff. And possibly that could be related to less exposure at discussions at that high level of higher ed and institutional health. We asked, how would you describe the probability of your institution's closure in the next 10 years? And here the vast majority not seeing this is from the SCELC community in California, the vast majority not seeing this as a likelihood at their organizations. 12% of our ER contacts said it was somewhat or very probable, and only 8% of deans and directors seeing this as somewhat or very probable. So counterpoint, obviously we're talking about a different geographic representation, as well as one person responding about one institution versus a consortia director reporting on perspectives across an entire state or even a different geographic region. But here we see a difference in that perception with SCELC libraries, as I mentioned, optimistic about their chances of survival. And the U.S. consortia directors acknowledging that at least one of their members is likely to close at about 65%. Moving to a slightly different scenario, as Patrick explained the merger, we looked separately at the merge factor, which may not have quite a negative connotation. It could be a positive merger, but again, less acknowledgement of this being a probability, both at the dean and director and the staff level. Got too many things to do here. And again, the variance in perspectives from the library standpoint, single library standpoint of not me versus the consortial standpoint of, as we've seen, that it's going to be one of you. more gallows humor for you. We also asked about planning. I like to think about the perception of planning and end-of-life planning being akin to what we're talking about with an institutional closure. If you think about your own mortality or have been given indications that you might be close to the end, you're probably more likely to start ramping up your plans for that end. So as we saw in the California data with not a high perception that they are going to close, that correlates to the planning in place. 93% have no provisions for plans or they're unsure if they do. But as I've discussed with my consortial peers, we're not planning either, though we've reported that it's coming and we know it's coming. Consortial peers are also not planning. Given that few, if any, had any plans in place, we asked about the priority in creating a plan, and across all groups, 89% of respondents were neutral or did not find this type of planning to be a priority, and only 26% of the people that had no plan were actually dissatisfied about the lack of a plan. So some avoidance of dealing with this issue. So when asked, thinking about your organization, what level of priority is planning to handle a transfer or reassignment of perpetual access? Only 11% saw that as a priority. You've seen this. This is the influx of some management company to close down a big box store. The people who had run the store all along have departed, and someone is in there selling off the fixture. So in this context, because we've seen it at SCELC, at some point the librarians are gone and there is a management company in there collecting all the assets. So we asked, before you get to this point, what kind of a game plan would you like to see? What would it include? So we presented some options in random order. And asked if ability to resell perpetual access right, ability to transfer perpetual access right, some of the things that you've heard the other colleagues talk about. And across the groups, the #1 desired outcome was to ensure the ability for current students to access materials until graduation, and in a merger situation, having a fair ability to purchase and extend access to a larger community. Going to zip through a couple of these so we can hear just a brief snippet of vendor perspective. I want to just give a shout out to the ICULT Consortia Awareness Group, who created a list of likely areas of consortial support, and we asked about those areas of support, translating them into a closure or merger situation. What do you expect your consortia to provide? So as consortia staff, if there's alignment, we can indeed begin thinking about those. So these are the highest priority service areas that consortia may be asked to serve. And again, with technology services, also a high need expressed for these areas of support for libraries. I'll just put these up here in closing on the survey. These were some of the additional comments that we received from the library community. Thanks for giving me something else to worry about in the middle of the night. There is no instruction manual on how to do this, and also comments about concern that consortia staff are going to be burdened with trying to solve problems they're not equipped to manage. Shifting into publisher perspectives, we did begin to ask the questions of our largest publishers on how they might handle this. And something you've heard from my colleagues already is communication. Early communication is key. There is a willingness to work through fair prospects for this situation. Thinking about these materials as assets, thinking about fair transfer. but it is a complicated prospect for them as well. It involves sales, it involves legal. There are many constituents within the vendor community that need to be consulted. In one case, it was recommended that the library should lead. Here are the major goals that we have at the time of acquisition and closure, and allow the vendor to respond on how they would meet those. Just some progress from the SCELC perspective. This is some language that we have added. It's not legally binding, but it is a commitment to understand that the materials have value, they're assets, and we want to find solutions together. I apologize, I took all the time.
Thank you so much, everyone. We are technically at time, so thank you for coming. If anyone has any burning questions, please come up and speak to us, and we'll be very happy to answer any of your questions. Thanks, folks.